This is Commissioner Shannon Reed. I am going to open up our work session just briefly by reminding folks who might be watching online and those that are with us here. We do not take any public comment or take any action during our study sessions. This is an opportunity for a presentation and discussion amongst the commission and direction for staff for future action. So with that, I see Sarah grabbing her microphone, so I'm going to turn it over to her, who will probably turn it over to Brooke.
Yes, thank you, commissioners. This is an exciting day, I think, for Douglas County. This is something that we put a lot of work into to get us to this point. And all the community has put a lot of work in to prepare proposals for us to consider. Just as a reminder, Brooke will go into her presentation and then we can answer questions. I do anticipate you're going to give us lots of questions here today, and that there will be subsequent follow-up sessions to find out more information. So I'll turn it over to you, Brooke.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, commissioners. Bear with me just one quick moment while I pull up my presentation and share my screen. All right, this afternoon, I'm going to run us through just a brief review of this request for proposal process, and then I'll come join you at the table and we'll discuss. I wanted just to remind us all where we've been and where we are now. The county received ARPA funding approximately a year ago. It was June 17th, we received our first tranche funding. At that time, we had a few discussions about future processes, and on September 15th, we began the letter of interest process to gauge our stakeholder interest for investment areas. Between September 15th and December 15th, staff developed a letter of interest. And as you guys know, that letter of interest process it guided policy decisions for investment areas. At that time, we decided to do a full-blown request for proposal. That process was launched on March 15th. We collected proposals between March 15th and May 2nd. And during that time, 70 external proposals were submitted and 29 internal proposals were submitted. After May 2nd, staff began review of each of those proposals, and the staff analysis was completed between May 2nd and May 25th. When we launched the request for proposal process, county staff did solicit close to 60 area agencies who either submitted a letter of interest or expressed their intent to submit a proposal through that process. So that brings us to the staff analysis. So each staff member completing the analysis used a prescribed template and a scoring matrix. The proposals were evaluated based on how they aligned with the priority areas for spending. And those priority areas that we were looking at were one-time projects versus projects with ongoing expenses, collaborations by sector, countywide investments as opposed to targeted communities, population served, pandemic funds received by the applicant, and the equitable impact of that proposal. In the next few slides, I'll go over each section of the matrix in a bit more detail. The project information section highlighted here, it was the most heavily weighted section of the matrix. It accounted for 35% of the total weighted score for each proposal. A low mark for a one-time versus an ongoing expense carries a significantly heavier weight than in any other section of the matrix. Spending priorities that I talked about just a moment ago, addressed in this particular section of the matrix, are one-time versus projects with ongoing expenses, the sustainability of the program beyond the performance period of the grant, any collaborative efforts that were expressed by the applicant, and the population served by the proposed project or program. The next slide, the project and budget section of the matrix, weighing in at 15% of the overall score, evaluated the amount of pandemic funds that the applicant received since March 1st of 2020. A specific value was then entered for the pandemic relief score based on a range defined in that section. The applicant's ability to explain how ongoing operating costs would be sustained beyond the performance period is also addressed in this section as well. And the grant capacity section was evaluated based on submitted finance policy documents and described internal controls. In addition to any written policy and described controls, applicants were also asked to provide a narrative explaining the qualifications for not just programmatic staff, but also for fiscal staff. This allowed the reviewer to get a glimpse of the capacity that the applicant has to administer their program and federal funds. On the equity impact analysis section, that analysis score was weighted at 20% of the overall score. The applicant was evaluated based on their ability to articulate some of the following: the direct or indirect impact of equitable outcomes related to their proposal, and their strategy for advancing racial equity and mitigating any unintended consequences as a result of their proposal. Answers observed during this analysis process for this particular section varied greatly. Some applicants submitted proposals with extremely rich narratives, including statistics, data-driven outcomes, and policy citations. Some proposals provided brief statements of intent or a simple yes remark. It was the primary goal of the staff analysis team to provide commissioners with a list of projects that align with spending priorities. Projects that were highly recommended are mostly one-time projects that may have strong collaborations, very little to no ongoing operating costs, or a strong narrative for how that applicant planned to pay for ongoing costs past the performance period. They may have received little to no pandemic relief funding. They have solid policy and internal controls and sufficient grant management capacity. And there were a broad range of individuals served with a focus on equitable outcomes for those proposals. Projects that are not recommended may not be an eligible use of the ARPA fund. They may not be eligible for, they may be eligible for their emergency use fund set aside by the board for expedient purchase of supplies and goods for public health. We passed that policy, I believe, in September. Or they may not be eligible based on spending priority criteria. This table provides the total funds available for distribution through this process. Of the 23 million that the county received, 2.7 million has been obligated to date. The greatest portion of that being allocated towards the emergency funding policy, and 1.7 of that funding has not yet been used. The total available for distribution through this process is approximately $21 million. I wanted to provide also just kind of a glimpse of the projects that were submitted. 100.3 million in projects were proposed. Nonprofit agencies make up the highest project submission totals at just over $45.8 million. There were 50 projects for negative economic impacts, 19 for the provision of government service. Those are mostly internal projects, 28 for public health, and 2 projects for public sector workforce. That concludes my brief presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen up here and join you guys down there.
Thank you, Brooke. This is Commissioner Reed. I appreciate you putting together that executive summary, if you will. I think it's helpful. I do have some questions. I want to double check with Sarah and see if there's anything that you wanted to add before we dive into questions. I just noticed you grabbed the microphone.
I think we're comfortable responding to some initial questions from commissioners, and then I would like to sort of ask the commissioners as to some questions as to how we approach the work. But if you've got some initial kind of logistics questions, let's start with those.
Great, thank you. I wanted to inquire about the emergency funding, and I'm just going to acknowledge that I did not do my due diligence and go back and review the policy that we created, but is that completely specific to PPE? No. Would you mind giving a refresher, or Brooke, could you just kind of on how we defined what emergency funding was? We saw two in our list that were marked as probable likely candidates for the emergency funding, and just curious if you can elaborate on that and if there are any others that you think might be on the cusp of the emergency funds that we still haven't allocated.
Absolutely. When we passed the emergency funding policy, I believe it was back in September, there was a really strong focus on public health related purchases. So, you know, as you mentioned, PPE, medical equipment, you know, things that might be affected by the supply chain. If we can buy them now, we need to get them now before we can't get the product anymore. But there was a very strong focus on public health related purchases as opposed to negative economic impacts and such. So.
But we did allocate funds for the Housing Stabilization Collaborative inside that emergency funding, didn't we?
We did, and I believe that that kind of fit under that. And I can pull up the policy too and just cite what it says, but it fell within the policy.
Okay, so it was immediate response for those kind of very clearly COVID response items. So I would say it's a little broader than PPE, but not a whole lot. It's probably a good distinction.
That helps. And I meant to say, in addition to the HSC funds, which is kind of not obviously not PPE specific, that was helpful, Brooke. Thank you. I just was trying to assess for what other items might be eligible for that, since we allocated an amount of funding and have we've spent some of it, but still have some of that left. And so I'm just thinking about that sort of as a separate pot of money.
Absolutely. And I do think that's something that should be taken into consideration as commissioners make these decisions. Do you want to not have that open anymore? Do you want to close that out and allocate all these funds? I think that's a question we should explore over the next couple of weeks as we do this. I think, and then not to change the subject, but we will also have, you know, what happens to unspent funds at the end of this process. You know, our experience with CARES Act is folks were conservative in their budgeting and planned for what they had. And oftentimes things did come in a little cheaper or a little, you know, or did not cost what they had anticipated. So we had funds available as projects closed out. So we will need a process or a policy on how to approach those. So I think that your first question about do we keep the emergency service portion of our funds open is a valid one. And I think we decided to keep it open, but I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's likely that we'd spend all those funds based on the rate we're going right now. Brooke, let me know if you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the way that we define the emergency purchase is the purchase of supplies, services, and or construction where the urgency of need does not permit delay in utilizing informal, formal, competitive methods. That was a mouthful, but.
Well, and since there are two proposals that you said would fit that, will those since our emergency funds are still open, will those automatically shift into that category? Or is that something we need to discuss? Because I think it would be okay to say we have an emergency funds policy. We should ask these two that have been designated as fitting under that to either resubmit to that or tell them, hey, we're going to take this and move it into this category. And it might be a quick move to get two of these proposals off of our very long spreadsheet.
Yeah, that was my hope, was to send them the request form, ask them to complete the form and return it to me so I can pass it off to Sarah.
That was our thought, was we just pay for those right now.
Yes, that sounds great. Look at that. Two
Look,
proposals
two
down.
Woohoo. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I have some project specific questions. That was kind of my most general broad question. So I'm gonna open it up to other commissioners if they would like to ask some.
I have one additional kind of broad question. So we had a discussion as we were setting up this process around kind of how much we wanted to set aside for internal projects and external projects. We were I mean, our letter of intent process actually generated a smaller overall number than this, which was not the direction we thought we were going to be going, which is okay. I think it helped clarify a lot of things. But I just want to get a feel from my fellow commissioners, and Sarah and Brooke, if you have any thoughts. Are we thinking about a certain percentage set aside for internal projects still? Is that?
I think what's our current percentage, Brooke?
I haven't allocated any funds yet for internal use. The $21 million is the amount that's available now, but that also includes the unused emergency use policy funds, which are close to $1.7 million. So you add that back in if we rescind that policy. And there's almost $2 million more to allocate.
So
Well, I guess that
oh.
right now, the total ask is 100 million. The internal ask is around 33 million, which makes me think that about a third of our ask is internal, 2/3 external. So do we want to kind of say we're generally going to follow a 1/3, 2/3 internal, external allocation? Is there some other level formula type? I think we had said originally a percentage, but a range, and I don't think we had set anything. So that's where,
Yeah, we hadn't. And I think the direction that staff was given was somewhere in the neighborhood of 25% to 33%, which would be in that kind of 1/4 to 1/3. What I was hoping to do with internals is I anticipate commissioners will have some questions on some of them. I have questions on them. And I think we could, but they did not go through the same staff review process that the externals did. I'd be interested in commissioners' feedback on those. But my hope was that if we were still trying to stay in that ballpark, that those we wouldn't necessarily compete internal projects against external projects, if I'm understanding what your questions are.
yeah, that's why I think it would
Yeah.
make sense to say, this is the chunk of money we're going to use for internal, and this is the chunk we're going to use for external, and then discuss them as two different pots.
Yeah. So I think from today, if I could get questions that commissioners have on internals, like, I think that's something we could bring back to a future session. And then my assumption would be, as opposed to the externals, if there's an internal project you don't want to fund, I want to know about it. Because it is inside those guidelines you gave us. I think the open space policy is going to need some additional work and conversation, but I think it is a pretty expensive project. I also think the self-help center is a lot of ongoing costs. And so what I was hoping for was our commissioners comfortable with us sort of what are the dollar amounts for those internal projects. Let us continue to bring you that work, but then everything else could proceed unless there was something commissioners had a real concern about. But then on the externals, our focus is going to be more on what are our top projects. I feel like I'm being unclear. Does that make sense?
I think that's clear. I would like to add one more
Yeah,
kind of piece of criteria there. So some of the internals are things that we've either already talked about from a capital improvement perspective, or things that may potentially dovetail with mental health. And so
Oh,
could we have a similar, not similar to the external, where if you already got money, it's less priority, but something where we could kind of see, okay, this is an internal project that would be very unique to ARPA funds versus this is an internal project that frees up some of our already planned capital expenses versus this is an internal project that we might be able to use mental health sales tax
oh yeah.
money,
Okay.
just to see how we can stretch
Yeah.
those funds as much as possible as well.
I think that's something the commission would like a little bit more analysis on internals. I think that's something we could bring you at an upcoming work session. If that's where the commission's at.
Maybe just share some thoughts on that. I think there was a number of projects that I felt weren't COVID related projects. And so, there are certainly needs and certainly something, but we have an internal budget process that they could ask for that. And so that was just something just as I looked at some of the projects in there, I thought, well, this is sort of normal stuff. So I'm concerned about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, the direction we said when we started this process is that we have wide latitude on the use of these funds, that we can use them for any governmental purpose. So I was working off the direction of 25 to 30% of this going to support one-time county needs to advance projects. I was less focused on they're definitely a government purpose, but the question is it how tied to COVID is it? But that's certainly something we can still discuss.
And I want us to be really clear, like, this is not, there is kind of not COVID related, whereas it's not directly related to the health emergency that we just had. But it's also, none of these are just operational expenses. We're not using this to plug any sort of budgetary hole. These will all be new, interesting projects that are still governmental purpose that we may be behind on because the county has spent so much time focusing on COVID. So I think that's still indirectly related to COVID.
It's hard. I mean, and we can pick on open space. That's a project the county has been talking about for a period of time. We talked about it pre-COVID-19. But it is, open space was something that did become really important during the pandemic. So like all things we do, it's layered and complicated depending on how we approach it. So I guess for purposes of our discussion today, do you want to talk about internals now, or do you want us to bring back some sorts, like some of that, the internal projects sort of sorted based off of that kind of, is it behavioral health? Could it be used with other funds? Is it part of a regular budget process, that kind of thing?
This is Commissioner Reed. I think my preference would be to have a little bit more information and staff input about the totality of those internal projects. And to Commissioner Portillo's point, some understanding of what other funding avenues may be possible for like the behavioral health sales tax, or I would agree that, I mean, because it wasn't quite the same application or entire review process, there is some missing information maybe for some of the internal projects that I'm curious for a bit more staff input about. As far as a kind of separate pools of money or allocation, I have been operating with around a quarter to a third. A quarter is really what I've had in my head of the money being directed towards internal governmental projects and services, and about 75% of it going to external requests and projects has kind of been the assumption I've been operating off of.
Yeah, and that was the direction that staff was working under, was that there was at least 25% of projects eligible for internal county use and for a different review process.
So maybe my issue is I'm just jumping ahead here really quick, but when I look at $33 million worth of requests and notice the dollars that we have available, we don't have $33 million. And so I'm trying to sort of, in my head, sort of draw some lines. I don't know that we expected any letters of intent around internal requests. And so some of these look like things that we may need to do and are very valid things. But I think because we didn't put a lot of limitations on that internal request, we just said provision of governmental services. I'm worried that some of these things, again, they're all good proposals, but I'm just worried about how we're going to draw the lines, even if we say 25% of the total funds, but that is significantly less than what's been asked for here.
But the largest request in that is a $25 million request that I don't believe that I was going to exclude that project. So you exclude that and we get well under 25% pretty quick. based off of just the policy decisions or surrounding that conversation. So would it be helpful to sort of, from that notion, to sort of have that sort from staff? And to bring that back like on the 22nd or at a future meeting that would, you know, our rating of those?
In my opinion, yes.
Okay, I apologize. That's probably something we could have done before today, so.
We were
Yep.
supposed to have a conversation today. I don't think.
Great.
it's,
Okay, and then
You're not behind.
say this is still a work in progress. If there's other I anticipate we will bring that conversation back. Okay, so we will kind of do a staff review and analysis of those internals, not quite at the same extent and review that we did for external projects. And we'll bring that back. Are we ready to kind of talk about externals?
Yes, and this is Commissioner Reed again, I just wanted to open it up to you, Sarah, if you want to pitch us some specific questions as you alluded to earlier, and you can go that way.
Thanks, commissioners. Yeah, I think, you know, as Commissioner Portillo mentioned, you know, the community response to this request for proposals was really overwhelming and very exciting in terms of the kinds of projects that folks in the community are thinking about. That being said, the total dollar amount asked is substantially in excess of any dollar amount that we have available in total. To that end, our focus as staff in our review was less about, you know, who's at the sort of middle of the pile versus end of the pile, but really what are the top projects where commissioners want to spend their time and focus on to try to get additional information, ask questions, figure out what information is needed so that we can make decisions. So one of the options I thought as to how to structure this conversation today was for commissioners to discuss their top projects. To start from that perspective, what projects do you feel most strongly about? And what questions do you need to have answered for those in order to make decisions? Then I think there's also a bunch of projects that you're not sure if you really like because you have additional questions to figure out. If you would rather not just share your top projects, we can just go line by line if you want. I'm kind of trying to read faces in terms of how you want to approach this.
So I just have some sort of structural questions that I'd like to ask and just quite honestly, and maybe for Brooke, how we spend the funds. So one, we have a number of proposals that ask for ARPA funds to be allocated, that then they will then seek other funds to finish out the project. And I'd be interested to hear from you. You know, what happens if they don't meet those timelines? What happens if the project, I mean, how long can we put those funds in limbo? Or is that a direct allocation to the organization? What happens if they never raise the balance of those funds? Is that clear?
Yeah, so, you know, there were a number of projects that did indicate that these funds would be used to bolster additional funds, whether it be state, federal, or private funds. You know, if we were to provide these funds and award these funds to them to begin construction or purchase land, and they weren't able to secure additional funding through other sources, then we would we would award them the funds, they would purchase the land, they're providing me with, you know, the documents that they made the purchase, I would pay out the funds. So it would really be left up to them at that point. And if they can't come up with the capital, then and that would be up to you guys. If you wanted to fund a project like that, you know, without really knowing if they've secured additional funding, or we could ask them to wait until they can secure additional funding. That would all be a policy decision that we can make here internally, as to whether or not, you know, when we award the funds, how we award the funds, and stuff like that. So I think that those are all things that we'll need to think about as we consider those programs where there's multiple sources of funding involved.
That makes sense. So we can use them kind of as a challenge grant.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense to me. My other question was around, we have a couple of requests that ask us to straight up purchase property. And maybe this is per se, are there buildings that we have purchased within the community that the county has purchased and then transferred that purchase over to another entity? I mean, because we also have property that is being underutilized. And I just want to make sure, and I'm thinking most closely of what used to be the United Way building, and maybe that's more utilized than I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's almost full.
Okay, if it's almost full, but I was just thinking, I mean, are there buildings that we've purchased and then handed directly over to another
No.
entity?
It's extremely difficult for us to sell property as a
Right.
county.
Yeah.
I think in those projects, what I would be anticipating doing is that we would be funding that organization's purchase of that property, not the county owning the property or but obviously that, I think there could be some contingencies. There are some cases like with the treatment and recovery center where we have bought land and then leased land for $1. So I would say that there are some organizations have those kinds of requirements. And so I would be willing to entertain those, but generally I was not looking at becoming a property manager throughout this process. Does that kind of answer your question? Are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm just processing through, like, I'm trying to think long-term, commissioners, about some of these projects, you know, if we purchase, if that organization purchases the property, then they have that as an asset.
Yes.
And what going forward, how they use that asset, you know, is there, if our intent was for them to do this project and they have that asset and then they sell it for something else. I'm just thinking, trying to think that out
This
loud.
is Commissioner Portillo. I hear what you're saying, Commissioner Kelly. I wonder though, how different this is than our typical like supplemental asks from our budget process. So if, say, for example, tenants to homeowners asked us for money to purchase property for long-term, like low-income housing, we wouldn't necessarily have the same conversation about that asset moving forward. And I don't know that it's necessary for us to have it with ARPA funds in this way, unless Brooke, we would have to, in some sort of long-term management perspective. But I see this as we could provide funding to an organization to do what they typically do. So I think if we were having an organization that was asking for money to purchase land that's never purchased land before, that's never stood up supportive housing or low-income housing, that would be a red flag to me because we don't know that they can manage it. We don't know that they know how to do that. But if it's a long-term partner who has done this in the past, I see this as similar to other types of funding that we have where we can have a one-time, let's do something big and important kind of funding.
You know, you're correct. Another example could be our Heritage Conservation Council process, but you know, we've in that case made, you know, physical or financial contributions to private property. So they retain right to sell the property. That being said, if you have desires to make sure, and as we've done work through like supportive housing, where if you make this investment and you want to ensure that it remains permanently affordable or permanently accessible, I do think that those are restrictions the county can choose to put on in an agreement if that is the desire of the commission. So yes, and.
This is Commissioner Reed. Yeah, this conversation speaks to a question I had in my mind about basically the possibility of or necessity of deed restrictions or maybe there's other language
Yeah.
for it that I'm not thinking about, covenants sort of, because when I think about tenants to homeowners as an example we're discussing, with that long history and of purchasing land, developing it, and keeping it in a community land trust, right? That's the model. And so there's permanency to it. But thought about some of the projects and wondering, I think it's sort of exactly what you're wondering, Commissioner Kelly, that if the project doesn't come to fruition as planned, or if it is more short-lived than originally anticipated, I mean, maybe we just don't have any controls over that, but thinking about the significance of some of these investments and if there weren't, yeah, I don't think I'm articulating right. It's not really a question anymore, but it's something I've been bumping around in my head with some of these land acquisition requests and the thought about deed restrictions or the way that our agreements about how the money is spent, how specific and controlling those can be in terms of the intent of use.
So I think I'm starting to hear more of what each of you are saying as far as what kind of restrictions we want to put on these funds in long term. I do just want to make sure that we're careful that any new administrative process that we develop for oversight of these dollars takes effort from our county. And we have already said we're, unlike many other local governments, using most of these funds externally. And so if we are to put any sort of restrictions that are unique from our traditional budgeting process, I would encourage us to also set aside some funds for increased administrative capacity, which we already had the discussion of. We need more increased administrative capacity for the county, period. But this would be a new and unique thing that we're asking folks to do. And I just don't want us to ask for new and unique things without funding them.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate that. I think we can manage that. I think we all want this investment to last. And that's what I'm hearing from the commission is that if you do buy land that it stay retained for that purpose. And I think that there are ways with a capital investment to do that. And I think we could explore that, bring that back to you. You know, I don't think that would have to hold up necessarily funding decisions because I'm pretty comfortable if that is the will of the commission, we can do that. And then we could find ways to make sure we have the administrative capacity to can manage that process moving forward. What I would say is I am encouraged is many of these are longstanding community partners that we've worked with, that we have relationships with. So adding, you know, this to the multitude of agreements that we continue to manage in this realm is something that I think we can figure out ways to handle. Other logistical list, kind of just big system questions, Commissioner, as to how to approach it. I do think that as we looked at it, there are some slices and dices as to how, you know, our review really was intended to bring you a first cut. The projects rated high are way in excess of the funds that we have available to them. I would say that there's a lot of nuance inside that high category that my anticipation is that commissioners would want to flesh out. If are commissioners comfortable sort of expressing their top projects, or would you rather start by, are there medium projects that you would like to throw into the realm of discussion?
Could we go one step further and just decide that we're not going to discuss the low rated projects?
Yep.
Great.
All for a low hanging
Great.
fruit. Look at how many
Love it.
proposals we've dealt with already
Two
today.
things and no lows. Got it.
I'd sort of like to hear other commissioners talk about, we have a number of projects in here that have a capital or what I would call a one-time purchase, and then have other funds that are also in the same request that are ongoing expenses. So it may be the purchase of a building and then the funds necessary to operate that building going forward. And I know and we talked about this, that sustainability was a real concern of ours. And I didn't know if that was a way, you know, do we want to pull some of that out? You know, I'll just pick on Just Food since we at some point we need to start talking about projects, but Just Food had a parking lot and yet also had quite a large number of dollars for food resources. And so I think it's important for us to talk about where that line is, because we had other projects that were all ongoing expenses, and I'm going to guess got moved to the medium category because they did not have any capital expense included in them. So I'd like to hear from other commissioners on that.
This Commissioner Reed, yeah, I think it would be helpful to suss out some of those. Just Food does come to mind. I mean, it feels like a large majority of the sort of land acquisition or building acquisition projects were for primarily that. But some of the other ones, like, oh, why am I blanking? Now my list isn't helping me. Well, I think that my feeling about Just Food, since you brought that one up, is that such a critical resource, and the impact of the pandemic is so significant on them, and the usage is way up. And I think that the parking lot and the expansion of or improvements for their warehouse are sort of a given for me personally. I think they make a lot of sense. They're one-time purchases and expenses that'll go a long way. And, you know, those two things equal less than half of their total request. So more than half of that total request is for food purchasing that I would like to believe won't remain such a high and significant need in 2 years, but I'm not sure about that. And I'm not sure how to assess that.
Could I ask a question, make a comment? And the question is for Commissioner Kelly. I want to make sure I understand, because I hear exactly what you're saying. That request in particular had one time and ongoing. So did that bump it into the high category? Are there ones that we don't see because they didn't have that type of thing? That was your question?
Yeah, and just sort of how do we want to, like one thing we could say is, can we pull those apart? Right. And so,
Yeah.
Artists Helping the Homeless is another one that had the purchase of 2 homes and yet also had 3 years of operating costs in the same request. And so,
yeah, and that's where I think that for me, how I'd like to approach this is that these are proposals that they put forward. This doesn't mean it's not an up-down vote on the proposal. We can say, these are our priorities. Let's go back and talk. And I agree with Commissioner Reed that, yeah, parking lot, warehouse totally makes sense. That's not the full amount. We could also ask staff to ask these organizations, if we do a purchase of a house and don't include operating expenses, do you have the funds to operate it? And can you promise that you have the funds to operate it if we're going to approve it?
and I was just sort of seeing how bright the line was for us between one-time purchases and ongoing costs, and it may be different for different projects, but I think it's something we should talk about because there are some very large asks of one-time purchases, and we could push those down to add some more ongoing costs. I just think we need to sort of talk about that.
Oh, I completely agree. I would also just say that I'm still at a point where prioritizing those one-time costs, given that these are one-time dollars, makes sense. It's not a bright line because I think there are some ongoing costs that are just necessary.
So one of the things that staff has done to help you get some of that information about the high rated requests in terms of all of them, whether they have ongoing or just all capital, is inside that total dollar amount of the project total that you see up there. How would they divide that out if it had to be partially funded? That request for information has gone out to all those projects this week, and we really told them we need that information back early next week. So I would say by our work session next Wednesday, you'll have that piece of information on how they divide some of those pieces out. But agreed. I think the question would become, if you said, like, for example, with Artists Helping the Homeless, we're willing to build the project, but we are not committing to any of the operating. Can you still do this? And if they say no, then the commission just makes the decision, makes the decision from there.
That makes sense to me. I'll put some more of my cards on the table and mention a few projects that are kind of top of the list for me. And they are a majority of them are housing focused, and the production of or development of and protection and improvement of multiple units throughout our communities. So I really like tenants to homeowners and Habitat for Humanity and the housing authorities projects. I think they're really solid. I know that there's been a lot of work going into the feasibility of those and the amount of units that they can create and add to our community, I think is significant. I also really liked the Baldwin retirement, I'm going to forget their full name now, but it's a USDA funded HUD subsidy low-income housing in Baldwin that's got 24 units that would be improved and maintained for much longer. I think that's a really smart use of these dollars. And I do like the artist helping the homeless. I certainly in support of the idea that we need those same services that we've been providing for men, justice involved men in our community, that we need to mirror that for women in our community, and the need is significant, but have concerns about those ongoing costs and what the feasibility of that really is, and what the capacity of their organization is to essentially double their work in this community. So those are some of the things on my mind. I also, this was not a highly rated one, but a project that I really like is Central Grazing Company. I think it's one of very few private, not government or not nonprofit proposals that we got. I think that it's a really interesting and unique idea. I think that it speaks to a lot of needs in our community, and that there seems to me like there's a pretty clear path forward for how that can be developed larger and sustained in our community beyond the initial investment that they are asking for us from right now. So that's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the top ones on my mind.
So maybe I'll do the same and we'll just sort of see where we land out. I think the Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority project was very high on my list. I really like the DCCA transitional housing. And one of the things I really liked about it was it leveraged the dollars that we have. The Housing Authorities project does the same, to try to generate some other funds. And so those are, I think, not only what they're doing, but also how they're thinking about it. The tenants to homeowners was a project that I highly scored. I liked the Habitat for Humanity one, but that was one that sort of generated a question for me about timeline. I like the Burt Nash one, but I'd like more details on it. Some of the there's $5 million in there around properties, but I wanted to know where they were. Do they have the land? Is this for land? Is this for building housing? I just wanted a few more details on that one. The Sexual Trauma and Abuse Center was another one that jumped out at me as a high need, especially. Maybe I lean too much on COVID impacts, but I do think that one is influencing my thinking on the impacts of the pandemic and on trauma and abuse. So those are some for me.
This is Commissioner Reed again. I'm going to jump in and say that I also have more questions about the Burt Nash supportive and rehabilitation permanent supportive housing, specifically around sites and location, also around the what the city's involvement and commitment is thus far, though. I think that idea makes a lot of sense to me in a lot of ways, and is very specifically geographically focused on downtown Lawrence and that part of our community in particular. And so I am very curious what the city's thoughts on that are, what kind of commitments may already exist. And it also stood out to me that proposal was close to $6 million for 20 to 25 units. which is not insignificant by any means. Some of the other projects were less than $1 million for the same amount or more units. And so that plays into it for me for a little bit. And then I also just wanted to make mention that I certainly support Senior Resource Center's requests, pretty small in comparison to a lot of them, but want to help them with that expense for their vans. And I really liked Peasley Tech's project also, and thought that was made sense to me that there's a demand for it. And I think it can be a good economic driver, and it's a good investment that's one-time dollars in our community.
I agree with everything that's been said about the housing pieces in particular. And especially the more questions about Bert Nash, because that how many units we're getting per an investment, I know is not consistent, because some of these are more supportive and some are just about affordability. And so there's a huge difference there, but I also want to make sure that we're using our funds to create as many units as possible, because we know that the need for units is high. So I would just like to know more about what's possible for each of those proposals. I agree with the Senior Resource Center ask. It's relatively small and seems like it could have a big need. I also just had some additional questions about the Success by 6 proposal, because it seemed very interesting, but it doesn't seem as well fleshed out or established as some of our other asks, but we did really focus on centering vulnerable communities. And I think that one speaks to that.
So I love that we're getting into this. One of the things as I think about how we want to work as a process, one of the options that staff had talked about how to approach it was, so if there's a specific question, Brooke can email this team a project and get that answer in advance of next Wednesday. I'd love to be able to do that. And I think as much as we can do that, I'd like to do it. If you just have general questions and want to know more, what we can do is sort of build that list of projects and have them come be a part of our next work session next Wednesday, the 22nd, and have them come and talk a little bit more about it. I am a little worried that if you have like 15 people on that list, we're not going to get through everybody. And so I just would caution, but right now I'm hearing some questions around, that Bert Nash would be one of those groups that would want to come back. Perhaps Artists Helping the Homeless and Success by 6.
And I forgot to mention earlier, the early childhood childcare center. I really like that proposal. I think that it did a good job of itemizing the different costs and also giving us some comparison about kind of what the value of those dollars are with the project they're proposing side by side with another, sort of similar childcare project and the amount of funds that went into that development. So it was really detailed. It is our biggest ask, and it'd be a significant resource for our community. I believe that very much. I'm curious to know other commissioners' thoughts about that, but I understand, for me, it would be helpful to understand what is possible for them to potentially fund through other means. And what are the things that we could potentially invest in helping really get that jump started without the total number requested, is my feeling about that.
Yeah, so my thoughts are pretty similar to that, and that I would really be happy to do something for early childhood. I think it's a real need that's been highlighted, especially over the past 2 years. It's always been a need, but I think it's exciting to see the work that's going on around that. Like Commissioner Reed said, it's a big number. I'd like to see how they can, that would be one that I would ask staff to go back and say, how can we reduce this? What are some levels that we can reduce this at? Because I want to do something there, but it's such a large ask. maybe I want to be careful of our time here. It may be helpful for commissioners, as tough as it is, to start ranking things and start putting lists together that we can compare with. Because I think we may be able to decide on some relatively quickly. And I don't know if that's something you think, Sarah, would be helpful for next week, or are we not there yet? Do you think?
I think that's something we could definitely do. Commissioners could do for next week if you don't feel, but I guess I was hoping before next week, are there other projects that you are want to see considered funded that we should verbalize now? Or am I just are you just going to come back with more questions for me next week? And maybe we just have to, just because of the timing today.
I mean, we're almost at 5 o'clock and I want to make sure we get a break before
Yeah.
the business meeting. I wonder if maybe each of us individually could think through, is there anything that wasn't talked about today, and email you to make sure you have that in advance
works.
of the meeting next week?
That'd be great. I think we could definitely make that work. And in addition to, so then let's talk about a plan for next week. That we would get those kind of lists from commissioners of their top priority projects, and if there are specific questions. I have we have a list of folks that we would like to try to have at the meeting to potentially answer questions. And I have 4 organizations with that right now. Bert Nash, Success by 6, Artists Helping the Homeless and the Children, the CCC. I'm just going to call it the CCC. In addition to that, we'll bring you back the internal information and we can just sort of continue this conversation. But I guess I would just say if there are other people we can bring to the table to have conversations before next week, you don't have to tell me right now, but I really probably need to know within the next day or 2.
Well, could we also say that just because someone isn't at the table doesn't mean that we're not going
Not
to
funded.
discuss their project? So like
Absolutely.
STA Care Center, I don't think they need to come, but I think we can still discuss their project.
Right. Agreed. I think we should send that message to the community for
Yes.
folks that are highly rated, that they, just because their name isn't on that list, that they're not, it's not that their project isn't still being considered and reviewed. I would just ask commissioners, just logistic wise, if you could also copy me and Brooke over the next couple of days, since I'm going to be out of the office, and then Brooke can keep moving those things forward. I also, as a bit of logistics, so because I think we have a lot more conversation to happen, my plan would be for us to have that conversation at the 4 o'clock meeting next Wednesday. The agenda right now for the 26th, 2nd looks not bad. I've got a presentation from LDCFM, and other than that, it's pretty free. So we could schedule additional time for conversation during the business meeting if you want. But then I do think we should think about having more time on the 29th. We weren't sure if we were going to meet on June 29th, but I do think that would be an opportunity for us to both discuss at a potential 4 o'clock if you're all available on the 29th. And then also we could potentially put something on the agenda. Just to remind commissioners, while we don't have, and I want to say here, I know there's a strong desire to get many of these decisions ironed out before we start budget. That being said, like that timeline is your timeline. We can adjust it. There's not as much overlap here as I thought there would be. And I do think some of this can be discussed in our budget process as well. And I also say, you can say we're willing to allocate a set dollar amount of funds and set it aside, but we have a lot more questions. You don't have to have every question answered and resolved by the end of June on how to approach ARPA. So just let that be kind of filtering into your thought process as you send your priorities to staff.
A question that I'm interested in that maybe we could reach out to all of those projects that were rated high, and I'm interested in this, commissioners, is if we pulled out anything that was an ongoing cost. And there were 2 categories in there. I think there may have been 3 categories in there, Brooke, that had ongoing costs. How would that impact? So since we talked about Artists Helping the Homeless, if we pulled out their ongoing costs, would they say, I'd rather not do the project, or I would rather be considered for just those those one-time costs. I mean, that would be helpful to me in making some decisions. I'm interested if that would be helpful to others.
I think that would be helpful. I also wanted to add to the ECCC conversation, another proposal that I am interested in, but that has ongoing costs, but I want to understand more about it, is the Compass project. So I'm familiar with them in the community and think that they do pretty significant work and have a high impact on parents and young children with getting really quick and easy access to benefits and doing some basic resource navigation. I'm curious, part of their proposal talked about living inside that early childhood care center in the future. So just curious to understand the conversations and partnership there a little bit more, along with maybe their partnership with Heartland and Public Health, which I believe are the two entities that, well, Compass Project kind of lives within Heartland Health, but also receives direct referrals from Public Health Department. And so, and maybe elsewhere too. So I'm just curious to understand how those fit together more and what the conversations or collaboration around these proposals may or may not have been.
Do you want us to have them come on the 22nd or just try to see if we can get additional information via email?
I think if we can just get additional information
Okay.
via email, and then just a note for questions for the ECCC proposal, like
Yep.
making sure we understand from them what their vision is with the Compass project in the context of everything. Okay, we're at 5:02. I do want to give us time, but want to allow space for any further thoughts or questions from commissioners. Brooke, do you have what you need from us today?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you want me to put something on the 22nd agenda at the 5:30 meeting to continue the discussion? Just in case as a placeholder, you feel like you're gonna not need it?
In addition to that, we have it's set for the 4 p.m. work
Yep.
session, right?
So my initial thought is that it may make sense to have the work session and then have it on the business agenda for the 29th, because
Okay.
by the 29th, they'll be able to make decisions.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. I'm afraid you're still gonna need more time in addition to that. So just be thinking about it,
Right.
but we can. Well,
We could
I'll
always put
definitely,
it on there and then not, and defer it.
absolutely. So I'll just have us put a placeholder in for an AIR for additional conversation related to ARPA on at both 4 o'clock and at 5:30. And then if we feel like now we got it all out, we will figure out the 29th from there. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, Brooke, and our review team. Robert Benecki is here, Jamie Shu's online. They all read these proposals and filled out pretty detailed score sheets. So, and Jill and I, so want to thank, and 700 pages of material reviewed. So want to thank staff's time and commissioners' time on this very important project.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I will echo that and just really appreciate how much due diligence and intentional thought that staff have put into this process, and acknowledge that we know we asked you to work double duty with this right before our normal budget process this summer. So we appreciate you. And with that, we'll go ahead and adjourn until 5:30 when we begin our business meeting. Thanks.